U bent hier in de tentoonstelling van Rini Hurkmans, Pietà, a Reconsideration of the Gesture. We'd like to introduce Guus van den Hout, art historian, former director of Katrijnenconvent in Utrecht. He loves Michelangelo, and he's also cultural heritage of the Vatican. So Guus, you can start.
Thank you, Elle. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Marjan. Thank you, Rini. Thank you, everybody, for assisting on this lecture. Yes, I have this tremendous love for Michelangelo, so I'm very happy to stand here and to discuss all these items about the Pietà of Michelangelo in the context of the sculpture, but also in the context of the exhibition which Rini has made and which I have been hearing so much about, and I've been participating in discussions about it. But for me, it's like coming home. Whenever I have to deal with Michelangelo, it was my first art historical love. When I was a boy of 12, 13 years old, my parents had this bookshop, and they had this book on the life of Michelangelo. It was called The Agony and Ecstasy. It was a book written by Irving Stone. And of course, it's a very fantastical story, but it was so incredibly lively written and so evocative that I fell in love with the artist Michelangelo. And in the end, because of Michelangelo, I decided to study art history. And yeah, so how you can tell that one book can make a big difference in your life. And as a boy of 16, I was so much in love with Michelangelo, and I bought all these books about it, all this reference material, that I nagged my parents so much that I decided that I should make a trip to Italy and that I would see all the work by Michelangelo in reality. And that's what happened. I went to Rome, I went to see the St. Peter's, I went to see the Vatican, I went to see Michelangelo's Pietà, and I stood as a boy in front of it, and I was so happy to see it. And yeah, every time I'm in Rome, and I must have been there at least 100 times, I always went into the Vatican, into St. Peter's, to have a look at my Pietà, or our Pietà. But that's a beautiful story, because Michelangelo is a very interesting personality. He is the first real big artist in our art history class. He was the one who created this myth that he was no longer a craftsman, that he became the artist, and that popes would be fighting for him, and he would be treated like somebody special. And that all started, of course, his fame started with the Pietà, of his Pietà. And I have to tell you a little bit about it. You can see it, of course, here in other situations, and you should see it, but it's very important to see it like this. But the statue was made in, it was commissioned by a cardinal, and this cardinal was the French cardinal at the court of the popes. And he was a man of 60 years old, and he was thinking about, 60 was already a very high age at that time, but he was thinking about what can I do, how should I be buried, and what can I leave for posterity. And he had his friend who was a notary, his name was Jacopo Galli, and he was also very much in love with the work of Michelangelo, and he said, I have to promote this boy. He was 22 years old at the time. And I have to promote this boy, and I have to give him this wonderful commission. So he said to the cardinal, let this guy make this statue, because it will be the best ever, it will be the most beautiful sculpture in Rome ever made. And of course, Michelangelo had to live up to that expectation. So he started this work, and because it was such a big statue, it's like 1.80 meters high, 2 meters wide, etc., he had to go and find the right piece of marble. And it's not, although in Rome, of course, you have a lot of marble, but already that's all used for columns and everything. So he had to find a piece of beautiful white marble. So he didn't order it like we should do it now, and we go to bol.com and they will send you a piece of marble in a crate. He went personally to Carrara, went to this quarry, and personally looked for the best quality of marble he could find. And that he was cut out, and then it's transported, and that's a very dangerous affair, and it went over the river to Rome, to his workshop, and there he was starting to work. And making such a sculpture is not an easy thing, but Michelangelo had this idea that when he had this block of marble, he could look inside of it, already seeing the sculpture which he thought it should be, and the only thing he had to do was just to chip away the pieces he didn't need, and then the statue was going to appear, but it's not, of course, that easy. In 1497, the contract was being made up. He went to Carrara, got the marble, started working in 1498, and he had promised to finish the work in 1 year. Well, a sculpture like this is so big and so complicated to make, you can't do that in a year. So, of course, it took a little bit longer. In the end, it took him 2 years to make it, which is still a good amount of time. It was finished, but by the time it was finished, around that time, the cardinal who had commissioned this sculpture had died. And he was buried in the Cappella of San Petronella in the Vatican. It was an old mausoleum, which was already built in the 4th century, and it was called the Chapel of the French, the Chapel of the French Kings. So it was connected to France, and of course the French cardinal, who was the ambassador to the French king with the Vatican, had the right to be buried in this chapel. And Michelangelo created this sculpture already for this chapel. But we don't really know. We know from the outside what it looked like. We know it had 6 niches, but we can be sure, because it was an old mausoleum, that it was not a bright space. It was a dark space, a dark domed space. You could compare it like a little pantheon, but very small. And there were the 6 niches, and in one of those niches was the tomb of the cardinal, and was also the place where the statue was being placed. But we don't know which of these places it was, but we know it was a dark place, and that's why the statue was highly finished. It was very much polished, because then it would get the best light, and it was also placed very low. It was also a little bit tilted, so when you would come in, you would see it, and you would really look onto the figure of Christ, and that would be the most important thing. And because of the light, all the attention would go to the Christ figure and to the face of Mary. And that is what we know. Michelangelo placed it in 1499 or perhaps even 1500. We don't know exactly when it was placed, but what we do know, it was there in July 1500. 1500 was a so-called holy year. Every 25 years, the Vatican, the popes, organized a special year. 1475 was one, 1500 was one, 1525, so every 25 years. It's still going on, we still have these holy years. So those were always moments where a lot of people would come to Rome, and the popes would pay extra attention to restoring objects, to restoring chapels, to restoring churches, making new roads to make sure that the city would be as beautiful as possible. So in that year, Michelangelo had his statue in St. Peter's, which was also the most important place for Christianity. That's where all the pilgrims would go. So he would know that when he had made the most beautiful sculpture in Rome, people would also want to see it. So making the most beautiful sculpture in Rome at that time, you had all the attention of all the people who would come, and actually we know that it was a big success, and everybody was talking about this sculpture, and Michelangelo was overnight the most important sculptor in the world, you could say almost, especially in Italy. The funny thing about it that we don't know exactly how it was placed, but we do know that 20 years later, about 1516, the sculpture was removed from this chapel because Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, had decided to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. So they started working in 1506, and in 1516 they decided to demolish this old mausoleum, this ancient mausoleum, and to get everything which was inside of the mausoleum had to be taken out. So they already moved Michelangelo's Pietà to another chapel in the church, and then it started moving around until 1736, 1714 circa, when it finally got the place it has now, the first chapel on the right in St. Peter's Basilica. But we know, if you've seen it, that I told you it was, at first time it was in a dark place, very highly polished, so at least people could see something and could admire it, and then suddenly it was in this chapel which is light and bright and big, and it totally has a different appearance. Now it looks like I always think like a little stamp in this big church, while at the time it was being placed in this mausoleum, it was a very big object in a beautiful but very small chapel with all the emotions around it. So you have to remember always that sculpture is always made for a location, and when you take it out of a location, it loses part of its importance, it loses part of its brilliance, literally, and so on. Now it's placed, since this accident, it's not more than a little bit accident, but the act of violence which was taking place in 1972, they placed it behind glass, and now of course you have to look through a piece of glass to the statue which is very much behind it, and always all these people are there in front of it making pictures and talking about it, but it's literally a very distant sculpture. I once had to, like 5 years ago, because I knew the cardinal who was in charge of that basilica, he invited me to come and see the Pietà behind glass, so I was able to go inside of the chapel. On the side has a little doorway, and I could get in and I could touch the marble of the Pietà. And for me that was like a dream, which I had already as a boy, that I wanted to really touch it. I had the right to touch it. As an art historian and museum person, you shouldn't be touching things, especially with artworks, but in the end, I think, well, it's harmless to touch the marble of Michelangelo. Of course, it's a statue which we look at as a beautiful aesthetic thing, beautiful, perfect piece of Renaissance art, but we have to remember that it was made with a certain purpose. It's a marble statue of two figures. It's Christ in the arms of his mother. Christ has been crucified, and of course it's not mentioned in the Bible, it's not mentioned in the Gospels. It's a story which has been invented in the 13th, 14th century, when people were like imagining how Mary would have dealt with her son. He was taken off the cross, and when he was taken off the cross, he was put in the arms of his mother, who was standing at the crucifixion at his side. So, and of course, it has to do with how you as a believer, as a Catholic, would feel if you would be there, and your emotions about this Christ who died for your sins, how that must have been. So they created this image of the mother, and of course the mother is us, it's the church, it's all of us. It's the mother who has her dead son on her lap, and she has to deal with the loss of her child. That's what we see on this sculpture. And of course, there are a lot of problems displaying it. And here, of course, we see a very young mother. We see a Mary who's like 16 years old, and she has her dead son, and her dead son is 33. So what you should see, of course, and which we mostly see, is an old woman, 50 years old. For us, it's 50 is young, but at that time, 50 was a very old age. People would not be 50, most of them wouldn't even make it. So you would expect an old woman with her son on her lap. That's already, and of course, women are small and men are usually bigger, so it would be a tiny woman with a big man on her lap. And of course, that's not what you see here. You see here a perfect pyramidal composition with a young, beautiful woman and a beautiful, beautiful man, because he's also the most beautiful man in the world. Christ is always considered the most beautiful man in the world, and he's on her lap. You have a young virgin with a young man on her lap, which is already interesting. But for that time, that made sense, because in the 15th century, when you look at all the things about religion, about devotion, Mary is often depicted as a very young and pure woman. It also has to do with Platonic reasoning. If you are a virgin, you keep your beauty, you keep your beauty, your purity is kept intact. So Mary is a young girl because she is still untouched, unblemished, beautiful, perfect. But it also has to do with displaying Mary. Michelangelo, you have to remember, he was a very intelligent guy. He was educated at the court of the Medici. He was a personal protege of the Medici, and the Medici were also very intellectual at that time. So they were very much interested into Dante, and they were very much interested into Platonic things. Neoplatonism was invented in Florence at that time. So all these ideas which were at that time in the intellectual humanistic world normal, but also inside of the thinking of Michelangelo. And when you look at this sculpture, you can see, of course, the idea is not, let's say, the artistic idea and the execution is Michelangelo, but behind it a whole world of humanism, of religion, mixing together in a melting pot which we don't really grasp because we are much further in our intellectual ideas than they were. They were very into religion. They were true believers. We are never true believers. They were true believers. So it was a mix of all these idealistic ideas which came together in the statue. Mary is young, Mary is unblemished, Mary is the mother of Christ, but at the same time she's she's a daughter of Christ, because Christ is part of the Holy Trinity, and Holy Trinity was the conceptor of Christ in Mary, so it's a whole mix of these ideas which you think, wow, it's strange, but at that time it makes sense. So Mary is at the same time his mother, at the same time she's his daughter, and at the same time she's also the church. She stands for the whole Catholic Church. So all these things come together in this statue. So you can imagine that for us that's like, wow, what's going on here? And we're looking at it's just beautiful, but when people in that time were looking at the statue, all these considerations were taken into their heads. So they were looking totally different to the sculpture that we are looking now. So we see here Dante, we see here Christian theology, we see Greek ideas, everything coming together, and in Rome, and creating the most beautiful statue in Rome, in a city which was filled with ruins and the most beautiful sculptures inside of the most important church of Christianity. That was quite a thing. So Michelangelo pulled it off. He became very important, he became very famous, and through this work he also elevated the craftsman to the artist as we see it today. The statue, what it's now, it's of course been changed. The statue was in St. Peter's, but we know, although it was very influential in the 16th century, even in the 17th century, the statue got a little bit lost to all the splendor of the rest of the world. Then you see, of course, in the 17th, 18th century, you become Baroque art, you get classicistic art, and only in the 20th century you see that the sculpture is getting its true value again, it's getting important again, it's getting this radiance, this idea about it, that it's something really special. I have to also talk about the arm. The arm is very important, of course, and because it's it's also the inspiration for Rini, her exhibition, from what's this about this arm, what's this gesture, what is the idea about this arm. First thing is a technical thing. If you look at the sculpture with this arm, it's very difficult to make this arm in marble because it's very vulnerable. Marble, it looks like it's organic, it's flesh, but of course it's just stone. It's a very, very, very hard stone. So when you create this arm, it has a certain weight, and it can just crack, it can drop off, it cannot work. So when Michelangelo put this sculpture in this chapel in St. Peter's Basilica, probably the arm was still being supported by a thin layer of marble. So it would be placed inside, because the fingers are very, very vulnerable. They would have been still all intact, and then he would have chiseled this away at the spot it was intended to be, because the risk of damaging it, and we have to say, it had to be the most beautiful sculpture in Rome, so you can't have a damaged sculpture put inside of the chapel when it's finished. So he must have done everything to prevent any possible damage. So probably he cut it off inside of the chapel, and probably he even polished the marble inside of the chapel to get the best result. He must have thought about it very carefully. So when it was placed there, he must have had. We know that the cardinal died in 1499. We know that the sculpture was almost ready, but we also know that almost a year later he got his final payment. So in between, there must have been a lot of things going on to make sure that it must have been the most beautiful. So, and then, of course, they started moving it, and of course they must have been very careful about moving it, but in the end, of course, it's almost impossible. It's too vulnerable. And at some point, and we don't even know when, perhaps it already happened in 1516, but we know later that it was in 1736 it was restored, and the fingers, those 4 fingers were already like cracked, and they tried to restore it, and we don't know exactly if it's right or not, because we don't have a lot of visual documentation about the statue in the 16th, 17th century. We know some engravings, but I think that the engravers were much more convinced about how can we show this sculpture, and if you look at the details, all the details are of course never exactly the original. So are they able to represent the hand properly or not? It was restored, it was put into its place, and then until 1972, when the statue was damaged, as you see in this picture, and especially the Virgin Mary was blemished in every possible way, with the arm being cut off, but also the eyelids and smashing on the face, etc. That was dramatic. And at that point, of course, they were looking into the statue again. They were discussing how can we restore it, what can we do about it, should we leave it as it is, which is in a museum as it should be. But in the end, the Pope said, no, this is so beautiful, we have to restore it to perfection, if possible. And they pulled it off, and I know it wasn't easy. They used all the original marble, which they found, all the little pieces which were scattered around in the basilica were taken, they were found, even with the duster, they found all these chips, they found it, they reassembled it, the parts which were missing, they used the marble in the back, because the back is of course not finished like the front is, because it was in a niche, so you don't have to finish it, you don't walk around it, you only look at 3/4, let us say 200 grades of the statue and not the back. And they used the marble in the back, and then they restored with the original marble from this piece, they restored the statue, placed it behind glass, and now it's like this icon. But the hand, first thing we had the technical part. The technical part is how can you make this hand, but of course it had a function. The function was about the gesture of Mary, which was as a church. You can also see when you look at St. Peter's Basilica, you have these colonnades in front of it, which are the inviting arms of the church. And you see, in the end, you see the repetition of this motif coming into Michelangelo's Pietà, because it has this arm which is like inviting you to come to see the body of Christ, because he died for your sins. He's the Redemptor. He's the person who died for your sins at the cross, and you should come and see it. And Mary is the person who sacrificed her son. She's the one who gave him life. She was the mother of God, which is already an incredible concept. But then she already knew this is a special child, something's going to happen, and she had to see him suffer, she had to see him die, but she also was okay with that. She understood it. She was like, okay, this is my fate. My son will die, but he will die for a noble cause. He will die for the sins of the world. And she is accepting it. She looks at as a child who's in her arms, and she's like thinking, he's here, and I have to invite people to come and see him, because he is the one who is going to give you the redemption, and I'm okay with it. I've accepted this fate, I've accepted this loss, but it's for your good, and I'm inviting you to come and see him. So that's what you see. That's the compassionate about this gesture. And the hands, the fingers, I always learned as an art historian that you have to be very careful about interpreting these kind of moves, interpreting these kind of fingers. We don't know exactly how the fingers were, but the most important thing is that you're going to be invited to see the sacrifice of Christ, and that you have to come close. And in the end, of course, when statue was made, you were invited to really come close to it, and now you see it, but you can't come close. So that's the problem always with art history, that sculptures or works of art become more important as works of art than as objects which have a purpose. They're used for something. They were used for devotion, they were used for beauty, they were used for contemplation, they were used for making you believe stronger, to make things which you are having in your head that you can really relate to it. When Rini was of course discussing this subject being obsessed almost by this picture, because that's what it started, to see this. It has this enormous iconic value to see this statue being almost amputated because of this strange person who thought that Mary was not the mother of God and he was the new Christ. Then you see how important beauty is, because you can't look at this statue anymore in the way we always looked at it. And this restoring it, looking at his arm, seeing what his arm means, and it's also a message now 500 years later to today, of course, because we are living in this pandemic, which is very difficult to deal with for a lot of people, and what we see is that this bureaucratic society we live in is going apart because of the fact that a lot of people are suffering. We live in a world which needs a lot of compassion, and the arm of Mary, who is inviting us to see the redemption of Christ, is also inviting us that we have to be compassionate human beings, that the arm is everything. Without the gesture of the arm, we are lost. We have to accept this, we have to embrace it, and we have to be very close to, of course, she would say you have to be very close to Christ. We would say you have to be very close to humanity. Good?
Thank you. Thank you, Guus, for a very lively lecture.
Thank you.
We know a lot more about this sculpture. That's so important.
Okay, back to you.